and welcome again to a preview of looking at the scriptures for the coming week, at least part of them. We can't do all of them with the time frame that we have. And this is the fifth Sunday of Easter coming up, in which the first reading will be taken again from the Acts of the Apostles, this time describing, and we'll come back later on to the Acts story, the choosing of 7 men helping those who in need, but also we'll see later on turn out to be preachers. The second reading continues the section from the letter to Peter, and the gospel today is again from John, as it will be for the next couple of weeks. The Gospel of John, as you know, and just a couple of background thoughts as we begin today. The Gospel of John is the last of the 4 Gospels written, but it presents, as you know, a different chronology in the life of Jesus than is found in the other 3, namely in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, if you think about it, here is information that we know about Jesus that we gain from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We find out that he was born in Bethlehem, and we have some description of his birth. Varies depending on whether one is looking at Matthew or Luke. We find out that Jesus, after he is baptized in the Jordan, is led into the wilderness to be tempted. We find out that he overcomes those 3 temptations and then begins his mission of teaching about the kingdom of God. And in fact, in those Gospels, Jesus teaches both by signs, which are generally known as miracles, and by a teaching style known as parables. Later on, we find that Jesus, at the Last Supper, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, uses words that we are very familiar with that become part of our Eucharistic liturgy, namely, take the bread, this is my body, take the cup, this is my blood. We then find out that Jesus goes into the garden at Gethsemane, that he prays there and is arrested, and other stories about Jesus are told. Now, my point here as we begin is if you had only the gospel tradition of John to read, none of that information would you know. In John's gospel, Jesus never teaches specifically in parables, but teaches in almost little talks, little dialogues. And I mention that because, as we'll see, that's one of the characteristics of the gospel that we're going to look at presently. The Gospel of John is divided traditionally by those who analyze it into 2 major parts, or 2 major books. The first is called the Book of Signs, and it runs from chapter 1, verse 9, all the way to the end of chapter 12, verse 50. The Book of Signs, in which Jesus is pictured as performing 7 important signs that help us understand who Jesus is and the teachings of Jesus. The second part of the book is called the Book of Glory, which begins with chapter 13, first verse, and goes all the way to the original end of John's Gospel, chapter 20, to the end of that. So it's a neat little division, the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory. The other characteristics of the gospel is that it begins with a famous prologue, which most of us are familiar with. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word dwelt among us. And so that important opening 8 verses of the prologue begin John's gospel. The 18 verses. And there is an additional book or chapter at the end of John, which is a story about the resurrection. Now, I mention all of that to kind of get an overview of how the structure of the Johannine Gospel is done. What we will be listening to for a couple of weeks now, on these Easter days, are sections from the Book of Glory. And primarily, the Book of Glory pictures Jesus or two episodes of Jesus that are pictured. One at the Last Supper. And we will find that at the Last Supper in John's Gospel, Jesus has a lot to say about to his disciples. And then the second part of the Book of Glory has to do with the Passion of Jesus, which again is different from the way in which the synoptics deal with it, and includes resurrection stories. So for today, we begin with, as you will notice, chapter 14 of John's Gospel. But in order to appreciate chapter 14, much like I suggested last week, one needs to look at the chapter preceding it. And the chapter preceding it, of course, chapter 13, contains material that is important for understanding the gospel today. It begins by Jesus being at the Last Supper, and he already, and here's a little characteristic that one might notice about John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, nothing happens without Jesus knowing it and allowing it to happen. Now, this is very different from the way in which it's done approached in the other three Gospels. So again and again, we will hear Jesus say, "Oh, I know this is going to happen," or "I'm going to let this happen." So that is a very interesting characteristic, the foreknowledge of Jesus in the gospel tradition according to John. So it begins by Jesus telling in chapter 13 his disciples that his hour has come. Now this is an important theme or point in John's Gospel. The hour of Jesus is the hour of his glorification. And now Jesus begins this section of the Gospel by saying, "My hour has come." You might remember that earlier on in the Gospel, at the famous scene at Cana, when Mary had asked Jesus to do something, he said, "Well, my hour isn't here yet." And she had kind of pushed it. But the mothers can get away with that, I guess. But now the hour of Jesus has come. And he begins by washing the feet of the disciples. Now this particular section of John's Gospel, you remember, was used on Holy Thursday. It's the unique gospel of that day. And as he's washing the feet of his disciples, Peter, when his turn comes, says to Jesus, "Well, I don't really need that." And Jesus says, "Well, if you don't let me wash your feet, you can't be one of my disciples." And then Peter says, "Well, in that case, wash me completely." And Jesus is pictured as saying, "Take your shower at home. I'm just here washing your feet." So Peter kind of emerges as an interesting figure. This is followed by the fact that Jesus sits down at table with his disciples and tells them that one of them is going to betray me. Now, of course, as this is a characteristic found in the other Gospels too, each of them begin to say, "Well, is it not me?" But Peter, always a little more inquisitive, wants to know who it is. I suppose we would be like Peter too if someone said, something bad is going to happen. But how is Peter going to get information from Jesus? He turns now to a disciple who is sitting next to Jesus, an unnamed disciple whom the gospel writer calls the disciple whom Jesus loved. This is the first, or sometimes called the beloved disciple. This is the first time that he appears. He will appear twice more in the episodes that unfold from here on in. So Peter kind of nudges the disciple whom Jesus loves, sitting close to him, person right next to Jesus, to get the information. And Jesus says, well, it's the person with whom I dip my hand in the dish. And that turns out to be Judas. But Jesus has already known it was Judas. And in fact, he says to Judas after he does this, go now and do what you're going to do. The others apparently don't pay a lot of attention or wonder why Judas is leaving. Of course, earlier on we found out that Judas was a thief. Remember, that was a kind of theme somewhat presented last time when we looked at the gospel. And he goes out, and John makes an interesting statement. As Judas leaves the supper, and he has had something to eat with Jesus. By the way, in John's gospel, there is no, as I mentioned earlier, there is no take this bread is my body, this is the cup, this is my blood. That does not appear in John's gospel. Only the washing of the feet seem to become the important point as this story begins that the gospel writer would like us to pay attention to. And as Judas leaves, the gospel writer says, and it was night. Now, he's not here talking about simply the outside, but it is also, at this point, as the gospel writer sees it, the power of darkness, that is, the forces against Jesus, will get to have their way. So, Judas is left. Once again, old Peter says, well, you know, Lord, I would never betray you, no matter what any of the others do. And of course, here is something consistent with the other Gospels. Jesus says, well, the cock will not crow till 3 times before you have denied me. All right. So that's the background now for the opening words of a talk which Jesus is going to begin to give in chapter 14 and will run through chapter 17. So this is going to be truly a long talk. And basically it follows a pattern that was familiar in the first century world, especially with those who were more literary writers. Namely, before an important person left, and usually it was leaving this world, and that will of course be the case in John's Gospel, they give what I suppose we would call a farewell discussion or a farewell discourse. It's an opportunity on the part of the famous person to kind of tell what we would call a last will and testament, what I would like to leave behind as what's important as far as my teaching. Sometimes in other cases it's a possession. In this case, the possession, we will see, is not a material thing, but a commandment. And Jesus is pictured, and again I back up a moment to chapter 13, where Jesus had said to his disciples, I give you a new commandment, love one another. Now, as I have loved you. And that, of course, is something that is the legacy that Jesus will give. But what is this pattern, this farewell discourse? Those of you who are more familiar with classical writers will remember that the famous Plato had talked about the farewell address of his teacher Socrates. And that, of course, is one of the more famous farewell talks. Moses, of course, before he leaves, gives a whole book, the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, is the farewell address of Moses to the people, the things, and in the course of it he records and remembers all of the things that have happened to him and the Hebrew people as they came out of Egypt. And then later on, St. Paul, when he is getting ready, noticing that his time as being a missionary for the sake of the gospel is over, gathers together the leadership at the community of Ephesus, and he gives a farewell address. So the pattern, my point, is the pattern that the Johannine Gospel uses is one that people would be familiar with. The last farewell, the important points that a famous person would like his disciples to follow through. All right, so all of that, now John pictures Jesus as beginning. He wants to assure his disciples, and it's interesting here now that these sections from John's Gospel come before his Passion. We might be surprised to see they come in the Easter season, but they do nicely fit into the celebration of the Lord's resurrection that is key to this season. So he wants to assure his disciples that he is not going to abandon them, but that he is leaving them. Again, Jesus always knows things, and so therefore he pictured as being able to affirm that that's what's going to happen. But he is not going to leave them alone. In fact, he promises to remain with them. He says, now there are two figures that appear in the gospel we hear today, the figure of Philip and the figure of Thomas. Thomas we have met already. There's another event later, namely, remember on the second Sunday of Easter, we had Thomas' famous acclamation, "My Lord and my God." But now we got to back up, and here at the supper, Jesus says to his disciples words that we are very familiar with. I am going away, and where I am going, you know. And Thomas, now you have to admit Thomas, sometimes I've mentioned this before, Thomas is pictured as a doubter, but maybe better, he asks the question. And Jesus says, where I'm going, you know the way. And Thomas looks around at his disciples and he knows that they're all keeping their mouths shut on this one. And so he says, Jesus, we don't know where you're going. And by the way, how can we know where you're going? And Jesus says, in famous words, another one of what are called the I am statements. And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now we'll come back to this. And no one comes to the Father except through me. Now these are, I'm sure that you have heard, and we've heard, these are very famous words from the John's Gospel. In fact, there are many famous words of John's Gospel which are characterized by the I am statement. Now, many interpret this, the I am statements, as remembrances of words spoken in the Old Testament where when God appears, and Moses at one point, you remember going way back, had been commissioned to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, had kind of said to God, they're not going to listen to me. How am I going to get credentials for this if I don't have a name? And God is always very hesitant to give a name to anybody, because you see, when you give a name to somebody, you got a certain hold on them. Now that can be good, but it can also put certain limitations or requests on. But you remember God had said to Moses, all right, when the people ask what my name is, you go and say, I am sent you. Now that I am, the very name of God, is often, by those who read John's Gospel, indications that Jesus is pictured as having a certain claim to divinity by the use of that phrase. At one time, he just simply uses the word I am, but here he connects it with one of his teachings. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Thomas, for the sake of others, gets an answer. Now, a characteristic, and I stop at these little points because I hope through these discussions get a little better feel for the entire Gospel of John, and to see that it often needs to be read in its total context. But what John likes to do is to present certain figures, and he presents them 3 times. Hopefully you will see, or we will see, that there's a little bit of a growth in their understanding. And so this is the second time that Thomas appears in John's Gospel. The first time we have not seen was when the announcement had come to Jesus that Lazarus had died and that Jesus was going to visit his sisters, Martha and Mary, that the other disciples had said, Jesus, they're looking for you. Maybe that's not too well for you to do. Thomas had said, let's go, and even if I have to die with him, I will stay faithful to him. So it's interesting that although the claim of loyalty to Jesus is often acclaimed to Peter, it is also given here to Thomas. So Thomas makes that a claim. He now asks the question, where are you going? He gets an answer. And later on, of course, the famous proclamation on the part of part of Thomas, my Lord and my God. So another figure here appears. I will come back in a moment to this famous I am statement, but as the little section that we're going to hear unfolds, Philip says, look, Jesus, could you show us the Father? Tell us what. Jesus, I don't know if he scratched his head, but kind of said, Phil, have you been here so long and you still don't know what it is? Now, Philip is an interesting person. Again, as you might guess, because I'm naming him, he 3 times appears. The first time he appears as a gopher guy. He has met Jesus. This occurs very early in John's Gospel. He has met Jesus. He has apparently spent an evening with Jesus, and he goes to get his friend Nathanael to meet Jesus. So what I mean by a gopher, he is one who brings someone else to Jesus. And this is exactly what he does. Nathanael, you know that story, later becomes a disciple also of Jesus. The second time that Philip appears is at the famous feeding of the large number of groups, and Jesus says, these people are hungry. We ought to give them something to eat. And Philip, now, who many characters in John's Gospel turn out to be very practical, Philip says, look, you see all these people, Jesus? Even if we had 200 denarii, now that's a lot of money in those days, we wouldn't have enough money even to give them a little portion. But as John points out, Jesus knew what he was going to do. See, if there's a characteristic I'm kind of suggesting today, that this knowledge of Jesus always precedes whatever action happens in Jesus' life. And of course, he feeds the group with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. So now Philip gets it. You've been with me so long and you still don't know me. Well, hopefully, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why Jesus now begins to give a little explanation, you will come to know me. Now I want to back up a moment to the famous saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to me except to the Father. This latter section of this saying of Jesus has been of some concern, and should be of some concern to us as to how that phrase has been used. Now, I think I have mentioned, but if not, I would mention that the original intent of this gospel is to support the faith of the believers to whom John is addressing his gospel. In other words, the message of John's gospel, if we think about it, is to insiders. These are fellow Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. So essentially and basically, his message is to fellow believers, not to outsiders, not really to try to convince others to accept Jesus as the Messiah, but rather to support the faith of those who already do believe. Now, if you keep that in mind, who is Jesus essentially pictured as addressing? Believers in his being truly the Messiah. And therefore, no one can come to the Father except through me makes sense to fellow Christian Jewish believers. But what happens when that phrase, somewhat taken out of context? Now what's the context of the gospel that we're looking at here? The opening 12 verses of chapter 14. Assurances by Jesus that he will not abandon them, that the course they are taking is the right course, and that they need to stay faithful to that. But what if you take the phrase, unless they come to the Father? Are we saying that no one else can come to God? Are we saying that Jesus' message is limited only to this small group or to anyone who accepts Jesus? What about people who believe in God, in the oneness of God, as the Jewish community will, the Islamic community will? What of those who believe in God who do not accept even the teachings of what we call the monotheistic religions? Are they not also have an opening to God's graciousness? And so in our time, we see the importance to recognize that this phrase has particular meaning to a particular group, but cannot be used to exclude others. Jesus' teaching, in fact, is open to everyone. In my Father's house, to bring this to a little bit of a conclusion, and I realize there are a lot of loose endings here, and there's only a few things that perhaps we can cover, but hopefully over the next weeks we can put the larger story of John together. It says that there are many dwelling places. Now, when you think of a dwelling place, do you think of a building? Well, maybe that is one of the ways. One translation of this, though, is an abiding place, a place where someone rests, a place where someone's values are placed. And Jesus says that my message will find many, many, many abiding places. And there is one of the teachings that the gospel writer John would hope that the hearers of this gospel would hear. So kind of notice today some very important things that Jesus is teaching. He will always remain faithful in some way, being present to his disciples even as he's getting ready to leave them, thus the beginning of this farewell address, that he is indeed the right way that they are following. He hopes they stay loyal to that, and that he will find a way. And now you can see again where Jesus knows what's going to happen, that after his resurrection, he will find a way to abide with them as he does with all who are believers. So kind of leaving some, again, loose ends here with regard to the Gospel of John. We will pick up the next verses next week as the Gospel continues. But for now, isn't it a wonderful assurance that Jesus is for us the way, the truth, and the life? And for all who believe, and for all who accept him, that becomes the great truth, says John in his gospel to us. I encourage you to read this over if you have not had the opportunity, and to notice the connection. If you notice something we mentioned last week, and I mentioned again today, that although we chop these little sections up each week for our consideration, they are all linked together. And so if you want to get a sense of where all of this is going, you could read chapters 13 to 17 to see how this whole message of Jesus fits together. And that might be, those of you who need a homework assignment, something that you could do. Next time I will spend a little bit more time on the Acts. It is an important section, and it is part also of this wonderful Easter story that we're looking at. So there's your something for you to do and as we come to the end. I'm told that this is now almost the end of my time, so I can't add too much more. But and check out the chronology of Jesus as presented in John's Gospel. Just as a quick reminder, those of you who are asked how long was the public ministry of Jesus, and most of us would say, oh, it was 3 years. You know why? Because Jesus is pictured as celebrating in Jerusalem the Passover 3 different times. And since the Passover is only celebrated once a year, if Jesus is pictured 3 times in Jerusalem for the Passover, then his public ministry would have been 3 years. On the other hand, if we had only the synoptics, we would not know how long Jesus' public ministry was. So that is kind of your Jeopardy question if you need to know where the source for that is. Again, it is a unique characteristic of the 4th Gospel, or the Gospel according to John. So for now, have a good week. Thank you for joining us.